Greetings, mortals, peers, and queers. Welcome to another interview with another leftist content creator. I am Lady Avalon, host of Serotonin Studios, and I have a wonderful guest with me today. This is going to be a great interview. I've been looking forward to it for the past week. So, to start us off, give us your name and pronouns.
Yeah, my name's Chelsea. I use she and they pronouns interchangeably. So I tell folks they can pick one and stick to it, or they can use them both as they'd like.
All right, wonderful. Well, introduce yourself. Tell us what kind of content creator are you?
Yeah, so I am a proud Appalachian leftist, and I make content about Appalachian history that has been whitewashed from our American white supremacist capitalist history books, as well as sitting down with interviews myself with other Appalachians from up and down the mountain range who are doing like badass work in the trenches around mutual aid or abortion access or community organizing, and all of the things across the spectrum.
All right, that is inspiring. All right, so you say you're a leftist. What drew you to leftism?
Oh, so I am not a theory-based leftist. I don't know a whole lot about economic and political theory. I actually was drawn into like community organizing in general
Mm-hmm.
right around the age of 18 was about a decade ago now when one of the folks who raised me, so I guess I actually kind of have to back up. I got into being a leftist because of my life story and like my lived experience as a poor Appalachian person and watching the people around me just die and be killed by capitalism and suffer at the hands of it. For context, I've always lived in Appalachia. My mom was a single mom. She was 19 when she got pregnant with me. And because of that, I was raised by a village of Appalachians, like church folks, neighbors, aunts and uncles. And me and my cousins were, being raised in the bathtub together. And one of the guys who helped raise me was an uncle who didn't have any biological kids of his own. So me and my other cousins were basically his kids. And this is like a man that I remember for coming home late from work. He worked on cars, mechanics, that kind of stuff, and did some carpentry. And he would come home late 7 days out of the week. And this is my uncle who I remember like could pick up a banjo or a guitar at any family gathering and just start playing. And like he would come home from work, and I just have these vivid memories of like braiding his long black hair and him sitting on the couch and his calloused hands. And when I was growing up, this man played a huge role, but so did other like family members. I had cousins who struggled with homelessness and addiction and domestic violence and all these things. And as I was growing up, I was also being told like, "Oh, you have to live in poverty the way that we are all in poverty, and the path out for you is going to be college, and you're so smart, you can go to college right away." So that's what I did. And it was in my first year of college that this man was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
And yeah, and I really watched for like 2 years while he and my aunt sold everything that they had, and they weren't even homeowners, so they were selling like their cars and their furniture to try and afford his treatment. And he was just treated like shit with I hope I can cuss in these
You can go
interviews.
ahead. Go ahead.
With no dignity, and just really treated like trash by the for-profit medical system. And that was really when I started to think about all of the things I had seen through my life and all of my loved ones that I had seen suffer, and like how their suffering was ultimately caused by this very like intentional systemic violence. And so that was really like the catalyst for me to get politically involved, but I actually got involved through the Democratic Party because it was the year of Obama's re-election campaign. It was the first year that I was eligible to vote as an 18-year-old, around the same time. And of course, healthcare was like a central talking point in Obama's campaign, right? And so it
Mm.
was kind of this perfect storm that like catapulted me into organizing with the Democratic Party. But it didn't take even 2 years of organizing with them, like on a volunteer basis, for me to be like, y'all don't give a fuck about my community. Like, where's the investment? Where's like the organizing? I'm the only one out here who's talking to rural folks. And that means if no one else is talking to them, the alt-right is talking to them. Like, they're being recruited by these folks. And so that over the last like decade since that experience with my uncle, I've just gone farther and farther and farther left. And I like to say, like, I like to give the disclaimer that I don't know a lot about theory because folks will be like, well, how, like, are you like a Marxist Leninist or like whatever? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm like I'm a working class community organizer. And I ended up getting my college like academic degree in social work. And I think that that's important because what I've seen be effective in rural communities like mine with poor white folks who are really being used as political pawns in this like racial division game for white supremacist capitalism is like healing and like trauma informed, healing oriented frameworks work in community organizing. And so that's really where I come from more than like the economic or like political kind of theory perspective.
All right, awesome. With us on our third question, I can tell that this is going to be an amazing interview already. All right, so you said you're not a very theory-oriented person, and you said that you're a leftist. Do you lean towards more any particular leftist label? Bernie Sanders is famous for popularizing the social democrat or the democratic socialist label, or do you consider yourself just general leftist? Or are you going to surprise us and be like, no, I am a Marxist Leninist Maoist?
I think that I have traits of like what some might consider like an anarcho syndicalist or like anarcho communist. Maybe I definitely am on the side of the left where the reason I think that anarcho piece is there is because I haven't seen any form of authoritarianism like at all that's been good for my people throughout our history, right? And so like that's kind of where I think I have seen community self-governance actually be really successful in ways that I think aren't seen as plausible or possible under the culture of like white supremacist capitalism. We're like, oh, self-directed like communities, that's impossible, right? But I actually have seen it work really well. For example, like my community got devastated by Tropical Storm Fred in August of last year. So similar, but not nearly to the extent of Kentucky experienced this year. And during that, like FEMA was nowhere to be found. Like our government entities were nowhere to be found, but self-directed community, like we were on ATVs delivering water to each other, like across the mountains where bridges had been wiped out and that kind of stuff. And so I have seen where like communities themselves actually do know how best to take care of themselves when they are given the resources and the support to do the right things for each other. So that's where like the anarcho piece is. Also, I'm like pro guns, like being a leftist out here in rural red Appalachia, like nah, fuck around, find out here. I'm not about that. So, but I do also think that like I'm not just strictly like I know I'm anti-capitalist, right? So like that's why I'm like anarcho-communist. Like I actually don't think money makes any sense at all. Like it's a figment of our imagination. It's like an arbitrary value base. And so it's like I'm anarchist, anti-capitalist, anti like white supremacist capitalism. Like I think that all of these things are like very intricately connected, and in order to like uproot them, we've got to tackle them all very much so in like the wisdom of Angela Davis and Bell Hooks and like those kinds of leaders, where it's like if you want to end capitalism, you have to end, or if you want to end racism, you have to end racial capitalism, right? Like so.
Right. So then
I don't know if I yeah.
that
Go
would
ahead.
be a great point to jump in with my next question. What do you think separates you from a liberal or a conservative?
I mean, I think for both of those, it's like for a liberal of any kind, whether you're a liberal that identifies with the Democrats or a liberal that identifies with the Republicans, what separates me from them is that I actually like don't believe in like the concept of a market. Like I think that we really should like I think I think that economy and like policy like politics have been so intentionally separated from the idea of like social and human well-being, and that's actually just not possible. Like we are whole humans, and so when we think about economy, like the idea of a market economy doesn't make sense to me, because it's like really anything that we create for the purpose of our community should be about humanity and like how are we surviving and thriving and evolving. So I think that's like one piece of difference, which is that like I don't believe in private property. I don't believe like um in like wealth accumulation or like bosses and like ownership. And sometimes it's hard for me to like articulate these ideas. I also think that like what differentiates me from a conservative is that that's the same kind of idea. Like, I don't think I'm a libertarian because I'm like, I am not separate from everyone else. Like, I see myself as intrinsically connected and I see the systems as intrinsically connected to me and me as a part of my community. And it's kind of like the never-ending math equation, right? And so that's why I don't necessarily see myself as like on the libertarian side of that anarcho spectrum, is because I see myself as an anarchist who like recognizes that my fate is inherently tied to the fate of others, and my liberation is tied to their liberation.
All right. That is wonderful. Thank you. So, what kind of message do you try and give to your audience?
I think I have two main audiences. I think my one target audience is other working class Appalachian folks who identify as either not aligned with any part of what they see manifesting in the political realm right now, or who identify potentially as like even moderately conservative, but who battle with like figuring out like, am I a Republican? This, like, I don't know what all this stuff is, kind of deal. And then my other audience is like white liberals who have access to wealth and resources. So, and my goal, the message that I try to deliver, specifically, like I have two forms of content: the podcast, which is more long form, obviously, and then I have TikTok. And I think my TikTok tends to speak more to that like white liberal audience base, where the podcast, I'm really trying to reach more of that working class Appalachian base. And the message that I try to deliver is like the way that, one, the media and politicians and people in power talk about Appalachians and Appalachia, regardless of what side of the fence they're on, is always like, it's not okay, and it's always intended to benefit them in some way, right? And like, we are used as scapegoats even for like the like I said, the racial divisions. Like, people in power like blame us so that they don't have to take responsibility for the ways in which actually they are the ones who are responsible for all of the harm that is currently being perpetuated, right? Like, blame the little guy, blame poor people, blame like folks who aren't even voting, when it's actually politicians who are passing policies that are literally building pipelines through native lands, right? And like destroying culture and history like in the moment. So that's one of my messages. And that part of that message in the podcast is that our history has been intentionally warped and erased and stolen from us, much in the same way that it was warped and stolen from people of color, indigenous people, and Black people, not like to the same extent, but that the playbook is the same playbook that's being used essentially. And the reason that our history has been whitewashed and stolen is because there is a rich history of multiracial working class uprising in Appalachia. Like, we hate bosses out here. We hate corporations and we hate the police. Like, we were running moonshine, and that's how NASCAR got born, right? Like, we don't fuck around with that. And when poor white people come together with poor people of color, like, that is the ultimate threat to the system. And so in response to those moments in history, we have been punished, more or less. Like, we have been intentionally divested from, we've been intentionally disenfranchised, we've been intentionally undereducated. Like, the Battle of Blair Mountain, which is one of the most profound, prominent moments in Appalachian history, I didn't even learn about in public school in Appalachia. And so these are like the ways in which they really try to prevent us from knowing that, so that also when the alt-right comes into our community and tries to like tap into white rage and recruit us into their ranks, they're more successful because we don't have that identity of like the working class Appalachians who were a part of this bigger movement that's not just white folks. So that's the one message. And then the message for like the white liberals is to stop. Like, my message for them is that the more that you shit on people that you think are hillbillies and rednecks, the more that you're actually contributing to the rise of white nationalism. Like, it's not helping me organize my community when you're like, well, those Kentuckians deserved what they got in the floods because look who they voted in. It's like, that's literally
or the people
not
who,
fucking helpful.
the people who said, "Oh, Texas deserves their power line shut down because of who they voted in," forgetting that gerrymandering is like a massive problem.
Yes, and that like actually Joe Manchin is a Democrat. So if we vote blue, no matter who, that's voting for Joe Manchin, my friends, like they don't put two and two together. And so part of my message to them is to like, one, when you do this, you're actually contributing to the problem. And two, at the core of this is still that supremacist ideology and that like need to be better than, and it's just manifesting towards poor white trailer trash as opposed to poor brown people, because that is what is acceptable among white liberals at this point in time. And so trying to get them to figure out like, you got to unpack, my friend, otherwise you're just redirecting your isms and your superiority complex.
So what kind of impact do you think you've had online?
I think I've had a pretty strong impact so far, especially with the podcast. I have had folks reaching out from all up and down the mountain range, like Canada. I have friends in the Canadian mountains, the Canadian Appalachian Mountains, in Pennsylvania, in West Virginia, and I'm in the Western North Carolina Appalachian Mountains. So for context, Tennessee, and then Georgia and Maine and New Hampshire, and folks just reaching out saying literally, one person said they listened to the second episode, which was an interview with a Virginian named Hazel who does mutual aid out of Southwest Virginia. And they said that they cried listening to the episode when we were talking about the loss of identity as Appalachians and how we're taught to like assimilate to this ideal form of whiteness in order to be considered worthy of value under this form of capitalism. And people have said that to hear like authentic Appalachian content that isn't relying on tropes or caricatures. I always say that word wrong.
Caricatures. Oh man,
yeah.
no, I'm messing up.
Yeah, I know. I'm like,
dyslexia is kicking in.
People know what we mean. Yeah. But like they've said that it's so profound to them and so impactful. One person commented on one of my TikToks and said that they listened to the first episode that I did, which is called "What is a Redneck?" and it's about the history of the word redneck. And like how it's evolved over time and where it came from. And they said that they had their conservative mom in the car when they were listening to the episode. And they said that she didn't make a peep. And normally she would be like giving all of this commentary, on what she was hearing. And they said that she didn't say a word. And so I think that is like, I think it's reaching the people who need to feel heard and who need to feel validated and who need to feel like they aren't alone out there in this world in the way that they feel. And then I have also heard, I have a couple of friends on TikTok who have said like who identify more with that like white, liberal, wealthier, more privileged group, and have said like your content drives me to be more compassionate and more compassionately curious about people that I would jump to conclusions about. And that has allowed me to form relationships with like my coworker who now like I can talk to about some of the politics that we weren't previously able to talk to because we would just like come at it from this place of confrontation as opposed to curiosity. So I think that the impact that it's having is broadening people's empathy and understanding of each other and themselves, and for Appalachians, of their culture and their people too.
Okay, so what impact has being a content creator had on you? Sounds like you're pumping out content on a regular basis, doing quite good. What is that effect on you?
It's been really positive. I've been a community organizer on the ground for about a decade, and digital organizing is like not my thing. We don't even have reliable broadband out here in all of the parts, so it was like content creating is also not something that I consider myself skilled at, right? Like I'm a Capricorn. I'm like type 1 Enneagram. I am not someone who is creative. Just
immediately bumps Mike.
But so what it's done though is like broadened. For one, it's helped me feel more connected to leftist Appalachians up and down, like all across the area. Whereas like I do have a nice little community here in Western North Carolina, but knowing that there's so many more folks who are doing solid work and we can learn from each other, folks like Hazel who are doing mutual aid and who are doing harm reduction, distribution and all of this other work. And it's been amazing to just feel connected and to feel like I have a platform where I can amplify the work that's happening on the ground and draw attention to it and draw even some support to it. I was able to sit down for an interview with someone that an Instagram follower like recommended to me, this person named Grace, who turned out to be a part of this group called Power, which is an advocacy group that's fighting the Mountain Valley Pipeline that's being constructed through Appalachia right now. And I knew some about the pipeline, but I had no idea about the backstory. And being able to sit down with folks like Grace and hear about it and hear what's going on, and not only learn more for myself so that I can be a more informed Appalachian, but also be able to help others gain more information for themselves so that we can actually collectively build power and act in our shared interest has been just really motivating for me. And it's also allowed me to, I love teaching community organizing, and I'm always like, how do I get more working class folks who are like me, who were bartending from and like waiting tables from the age of 15? Like, how do I get the skills and the knowledge and the network into the hands of my people so that we can build power? And I've already had multiple people start reaching out and saying like, hey, like what you talked about in this episode is really interesting. I would love to learn more. And so we're actually rolling out our first pilot of a like learning community. Where
Hey,
we're
that's
gonna
pretty good.
yeah, doing trainings like each week until the first week of December. And so it's just given me more opportunities and ways to expand this movement building work that has been a breath of fresh air and much needed.
All right. So, what are then some of the leftist issues that are most important to you?
Ooh, I mean, for one, I just, it's hard for me to pick out one because they're all so deeply interconnected under, again, white supremacist capitalism to me. Like, I think for one, the idea of abolishing assigning value to human beings. I mean, Appalachia is at the crux of the healthcare crisis, the housing crisis. We don't have access to public transportation. We don't have access to decent employment and good jobs. Most of our jobs were sent overseas during like thanks to NAFTA and like globalizing of industrial capitalism. And so I think for me, it's like the leftist community, like what's most important is that we actually reinvent new ways of being outside of this reality that we've been given. Like, I think so much of the leftist community that I have seen ends up hyper focusing on like, oh, we either need to focus on electoralism or we need to focus on mutual aid or we need to focus on like this one particular thing. And I think that's great. Like if you have something that you are really good at and you want to lean into that with all of your energy and capacity, that's great. And I think we as a movement, though, don't need to lean into one direction. Really what it is, it's about this. There's this model called the 4Rs framework that I learned from the North Carolina Climate Justice Collective. And the 4Rs stand for resist, reform, reimagine, and recreate. And the idea is that we need all four of those happening in order for us to actually achieve a just transition where we can all thrive as a human species, a human collective. And so I think for me, for leftists, what's most important is that we embody that. We like resist what isn't working and we disrupt it. And that's like the direct action. I've gotten arrested for disrupting legislative sessions, like doing shit like that. The reform is the Bernie Sanders, right? Like the run people who are trying to change the system from the inside out. Yes, that's amazing, but don't put all our eggs in that basket because we know what happens when the AOCs actually get into office and then start getting all of that big funding. And then at the same time that we're doing that resistance and that reformation, reimagining and recreating the alternative reality for people to step into. It's like the idea of a general strike, for example. I support the idea of a general strike. And you know what has made strikes successful throughout history? They've had strike funds. They have had mutual aid networks that are robust, set up to house people who are being evicted from their company coal towns. Like, so if we as a movement want to call for a general strike, we've got to have the equivalent of
We got to
those
have the
networks set up.
infrastructure in place.
Exactly. And that I think is the biggest thing for me. And when we do that, what we are showing, we're demonstrating a crisis of power when we embody and when we build those infrastructures outside of white supremacist capitalism, because the crisis of power is like capitalism depends on this myth that this is the way of being and that there's no successful way of being outside of it. And so we can literally counter that through our existence if we are smart and strategic about it.
All right. That's wonderful. So I think we've given the audience with 24 minutes, 25 minutes in, the first section of the interview, which is to give them a rough idea of who you are and what you're about and what you believe. So we'll move on to the next section of questions, which is what are your thoughts on the world around us? So, what do you think of the current state of the United States, of the U.S.?
I mean, it is we are like it is late stage capitalism at its best. I'm like, there is nothing to cheer on about the condition of the United States. We have multiple major cities that don't even have access to clean water. We have we want to try and be a climate champion, but then we pass legislation that is going to undermine things like the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act in order to make way for the construction of pipelines for fossil fuels that we know are no longer actually sustainable for our existence. We have people who are working 60 and 70-hour jobs who can't afford to keep a roof over their head. My partner and I have been together for 10 years, and he has never had healthcare insurance coverage because we live in a state that did not expand Medicaid, and he falls into that coverage gap. And I have nothing good to say right now. I'm like, I don't know if I can send my toddler to school in the future, mostly because it's like I don't want him to either be the victim of a school shooting or as a little white assigned male at birth child to end up being the school shooter, because capitalism is literally traumatizing us and like creating these perfect storm conditions for violence on purpose. Like I feel like everything about the United States, from electoralism, like the way that our politics work, is so clearly just owned by the rich and powerful, and we as a people don't actually have a say. From our economy to our politics to the way that we have been intentionally divided from each other as community so that we can't rely on each other and get to know each other, and we live in this constant state of like fear and isolation. Yeah, I have nothing good to say about it.
Okay. Well, you might be the last interviewee to get this question, depending on scheduling. How do you think the 2022 midterms will go? We've already
Oh
seen some of the
man.
primaries finished up. How do you think the midterms will go?
Yeah, the biggest psyop of our lifetime, maybe so far. It's like we've got all of Roe versus Wade leading up to it because the Democrats are like, oh God, we got to give them a reason to vote for us, right? Because Biden didn't actually follow through on any of his promises in relation to like student loans and like all of these other relief efforts. And so I genuinely do not know. And I know how things are going to go in my neck of the woods because they're going to go the same way that they always go, which is like I live in Madison Cawthorn's congressional district. Cawthorn lost his primary to a guy named Chuck Edwards, who is equally as evil as Cawthorn and way smarter. So we went from Mark Meadows to Madison Cawthorn, and now we're going to have Chuck Edwards. And I really think that I think the results of the midterm are going to be more clear embedment of like the partisan divide. That's what I think is going to happen as a result of like the global pandemic, the Roe versus Wade leaks and shenanigans, and even like the shootings that were happening like simultaneously with Roe that were like triggering the conversation around gun control. And like I really think that what's going to happen is like the places that are turning blue are going to like deepen their blueness, the places that are turning red are going to deepen their redness. And like really what this is about like creating more stark divisions as opposed to like who's going to win and who's going to lose.
So speaking to that, with the Roe versus Wade, and we've seen places like Alaska kick out Sarah Palin, a Republican, and have a Democrat win for the first time in decades. And with Roe versus Wade, we're seeing Republicans pull back from that, pull back from their national bans as they realize how wildly unpopular it is. Do you think that the Democrats have a chance of winning the midterms? Do you think they'll edge out, or do you think it'll be a stalemate, or even worse, the Republicans will win?
Yeah, I think that we're going to end up in more or less of a stalemate. I mean, we do have places like Alaska and Kansas where when it was put on the ballot initiative, like the voters themselves decided to protect abortion rights in Kansas. Um, and I think that part of that speaks to the the working class like group that is at that ambiguous part of the spectrum where they dance between like anarcho and libertarian almost, right? Because they're like, I believe in bodily autonomy, I want my guns, I believe in freedom of speech, but they also are like not sure they're down with the socialists, so they don't
Yeah.
really know how to feel, so they're dancing up there. And I think that those folks really come out and do end up voting along with their values more on a deeper level in situations like this. But I also think that like the way that I view politics is I'm not much into sports, but I did used to play soccer. And the way that I view politics is like instead of it actually being like Republicans are on one team and the Democrats are on another, and soccer in your team, you kind of have two sub teams. And the first sub team is offense, and the other sub team is defense. And people who play offense don't have the same skill set as the people who play defense. They are actually different roles, and they both are very important for the team. And I see in politics that, from my perspective, you've actually got like team rich and powerful, and then you've got like team the rest of us. And team rich and powerful is like the Democrats are on defense and the Republicans are on offense, and the goals are actually power and wealth. And so what the Democrats' role on defense is to actually just keep us as like team working class from scoring any goals in the shape of power and wealth. So every time we pass them the ball, for example, it's like, oh, they hold on to it for a minute, they do a little jig, right? Like we passed it to Obama and he's like, oh, you get the Affordable Care Act instead of like actual like universal health care and like freedom of choice, like I promised. And we pass it to Biden and we pass it to these other Democrats. And even on a local level, like um, the Democratic challenger in my congressional district, for example, Jasmine Beach Ferrara is currently a Buncombe County Commissioner in Asheville, North Carolina, Buncombe County. And in her seat as a Buncombe County Commissioner, cast the tie-breaking vote to approve of the construction of a Raytheon plant and a pipeline to go through the Blue Ridge Mountains here. So a Democrat approved that pipeline vote, right? And so it's like, for me, I see the Democrats just play this role of like, oh, vote for me, it'll all be good, and in order to prevent us from actually scoring goals as team working class, whereas the Republicans are just the offensive team. So that's why they are more overt in their attacks on wealth and power of the working class and of everyday people. And so for me, it's like, I don't actually know if the Democrats are going to win, but what I do know is that regardless of who does win, we don't. And I think that part of what they depend on is us getting so caught up in this like urgency culture around elections. And that's why we have this constant pace of like, oh, it's midterm year, oh, it's a presidential year, and it never really ends. And they depend on that so that we get caught up. I don't know if you just heard my dog rip one. But so that we get caught up in like that and we're actually distracted by the ways that we can actually score goals and like play around the team rich and powerful.
Okay. Then, all right, that is a lot. And I almost want to jump ahead in some of my questions. But sticking to the program, how do you think the 2024 presidential runs will go?
Oh God. I don't even want to, I'm like, I don't even want to know. I think I feel like we are coming to the head of a systemic shakeup. I don't know what that is or what that looks like. I'm not like a prophet. I don't have all the answers. I'm certainly not an expert, but I do feel like the lack of sustainability in the current like trajectory is like coming to a head. And so in the 2024 presidential election, I don't really have any predictions. I don't even know who the Democrats are going to put up. Like, are they really going to put up Biden for re-election in this one? Is Trump going to run for re-election? I don't even try. I'm like, I don't even try to predict it anymore because truly it's just, what are these people doing? And none of it is logical.
All right. What do you think of the Supreme Court?
I think that historically speaking, the institutions of this country, whether they are the electoral, the Supreme Court, the criminal justice, the public education system, I think that every institution in this country has been intentionally created in order to best serve those who are among the rich and powerful. I think that group of who's among the rich and powerful has changed over time, and as a result, has like slightly shifted how some of these institutions interact with each other and like the weight that they carry. But I don't actually think that any of them were ever really intended to benefit the working class, and that's why there were so many rules and guidelines even around like who qualified as like a full voting citizen from the very beginning of them starting to build out these institutions. And so the Supreme Court, while I think that it's important on paper and like for the purpose of the way that our country works, like preserving what little illusion of autonomy and rights we do have. And that said, I earlier this year, when the leak of Roe dropped, not the actual decision itself, but the leak of Roe dropped, I mean, immediately through my head, and I am not someone who normally waves things off as like, oh, it's just a psyop, it's like crazy, it's all a skit or whatever. But I was immediately like, oh, this is weirdly convenient that this leak just happens, as if they're just going to let a leak somehow miraculously make its way to the mainstream media about this major decision that they know they're going to count on for reelection this year in the wake of like all of these failures and ways that they have let down the working class and the promises that they have broken. And so for me, it's like, what if the Supreme Court is actually just another tool for them to use in their playbook of soccer plays to make, right? So like if we have to, we'll kick the ball over to them. They'll like do a little header, a fun little thing, and then they'll give it back to us ultimately. So I think that like the Supreme Court, and that's why they also get us focused on these little arguments over like, oh, well, should we stack the court? Should we change how many seats are on the court? Blah, blah, blah. It's like, actually, does any of that address the issue here? Which is that like a bunch of old fogies who were picked by people from my grandma's generation, for the most part, are making decisions about our life and our future, like with essentially utmost authority. And so that's like the problem there. And that's where, like, kind of going back to the original questions, like the authoritarianism, like I just don't see any form of like complete authority in that way that has ever served the interests of the critical mass of people.
All right. So then what is, and we've talked about this a little bit, been touched on, what is the left's position on Democrats? Are they friend? Are they foe? Are they something more?
In my opinion, they are foe. I think that so here's where I stand. A lot of people are like, oh, you don't vote, therefore, like, you're horrible, whatever. I vote. I vote in every election. I also do not shame or encourage other people around the act of voting. Like, I just don't see it as I 100% do not believe in my heart of hearts that any Democratic candidate is going to be our savior. They're just not going to do it. And that's not necessarily because I think they go in with bad intentions. I just don't think that reform is the way. And I don't think that we can count on any one person or any one party to do the right thing. And they've been given plenty of chances and time to show us that. I do think that there's like a level of difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, but how much difference is really subjective and like in the eye of the beholder. And I say this as someone, like I said, like I got my start in organizing through the Democratic Party. And in 2016, so full disclosure, please don't judge me if you're watching this interview. 2016, I was a huge Bernie stan and did like volunteer stuff on campus. I was still in college at the time. And then he lost the primary. I had already been doing some organizing from the Obama campaign and like had been involved on campus. And when Bernie lost, I wrote this Facebook novel, being the drama queen that I am, about how disappointing the Democratic Party was and how they're two sides of the same coin and blah, blah, blah. And I get a call within a couple of weeks from this regional organizing director on behalf of the North Carolina Coordinated Campaign, which is the Democratic Party. And they were like, hey, a local politician gave us your name when we were looking for potential organizers to work for the Democratic Party in this year's presidential election in Western North Carolina. We need someone who is local, can like speak to the community members. And because of your organizing, this person gave us your name. We wanted to reach out and see if you would consider taking this role with us. So I did some reflection and I came to the conclusion that Trump was a clear and present danger, and so I would take one for the team, and I took the job. I was given an organizing position in 3 counties: Haywood County, Swain County, and Madison County. And the way that organizing math works in transactional electoral politics is that you do math based on how many volunteer shifts you need to fill in order to talk to or engage with the number of voters that you need to turn out to the polls to win the election. So it's all about the shifts that you have to fill. How many volunteers do I need to get to sign up for shifts? So early voting starts 2016 presidential election, and my shift goals for 3 whole Appalachian counties were 0. And when so I got sent out of turf to go knock on doors in the suburb area about 3 hours away. And when I confronted my regional organizing director about it, the same person who had called me asking me to take the job that I never applied for in the first place, they said verbatim, it's not worth our time for you to knock on doors out here in Western North Carolina. So for me, I have many years of like healing and therapy and trying to figure out what this means for me. I've come to the conclusion that I think the Democrats benefited just as much from 2016. Like, I don't actually think that there was this naivete around like, oh, we didn't invest enough in rural communities, we should have known better. Like, I actually feel like there was a level of it that was coordinated. Like, no one said to me, oh, Chelsea, we're removing you on purpose, this is all coordinated. But it just felt to me like, okay, wait, you hired me for this, and then you sent me away from here. And so how much of what happened in 2016 was actually Team Rich and Powerful working together for the outcome that would benefit Team Rich and Powerful the most, regardless of what party was next to their name? And so for me, ever since that moment, I was like, Democrats, they don't give a shit. They don't want to organize us. They don't want our votes. They really do not care less, at least about me and my community. And like I said, the same is true for like the congressional Democratic candidate here. She was okay with literally destroying our historic mountains in order to construct a pipeline for an arms facility in Western North Carolina. It's like, that is not our friend, you know? And if people don't want to call the Democrats foes because they see somebody like Trump and they're like, oh, well, it's not the same. Like, fine, that's on you, but they're not my friend.
Okay. What is then the left's issue, or sorry, what is the left's position on Biden?
Fuck Biden. I don't speak for the whole left probably, but for me, fuck Biden. Biden is Trump 2.0. I mean, for all intents and purposes, it's just like they're like, here's the decaffeinated version of Trump, right? Like, same shit, just less spark to it.
That's interesting. He did the $10,000 and $20,000 of cancellation of student debt, and the debt reform, and he's done a lot of work for unions and things like that, and raising the minimum wage in areas where he can. Do you really think that Biden and Trump are comparable in that way?
I think that everything that Biden has done has been little more than throwing t-shirts at the crowd to make them feel good about the sports event. As someone with $50,000 student loans, that $10,000 is not going to do me any good, and I am literally going to reaccumulate that due to the interest rate faster than Like it's literally not going to do me any good. And in addition to that, like, I don't know where Biden has increased the minimum wage, but the federal minimum wage increased in states like mine in North Carolina. We are still working for the same minimum wage that I was working for when I was 15 years old, and I'm 28 now. And I mean, go ahead. Were you saying something, or did I hear an echo of myself?
That might have been an echo.
So I just don't think, I mean, while Trump was verbally abusive, I think that Biden is much more sneaky and nefariously abusive. Like Biden, it reminds me of like the type of folks who commit like intimate partner violence that everyone around town sees and it's like, oh, they're such a good guy though, and like they act so great, or they're like, that person, he wouldn't hurt a fly, right? Because it's like he puts on this good like public show. But I actually think that it's equally like just as much violence is happening. It's just not happening in front of people.
I definitely want to bring you on for another interview to get more in depth in this. But moving on to our next question, what are some flagship issues for the left?
Flagship issues. Can you tell me what that means?
Like Bernie Sanders used Medicare for All as a rallying point to unite lots of disparate parts of the left for a single united cause, and it gained him a lot of support. What are some big tent issues for the left that that we could rally around, that we could gain the most amount of support for? What do you think is some of the best selling points, I suppose?
Yeah, thank you. I think for one, healthcare is absolutely, like, I would call the issue that we could rally around, at least from what I've seen in my experience in Appalachia with like working class folks who would otherwise consider themselves conservative. For example, 2017, I was doing a community listening survey as part of this grassroots organizing that I was a part of, and we were trying to figure out what issue we were going to tackle as a community. And we didn't want to just come in with an agenda. We wanted to find out from the community what they wanted to see us tackle. So we asked 3 questions, and the questions were essentially, what are the issues that like keep you awake at night? What are you really dealing with right now? What do you think would actually be a solution that would impact that and make a change in that for you? Like, what do you think would make a difference? And then who do you actually think has the power or the responsibility to bring that solution to life? And we did this like, knock every door style campaign. I'm like driving up in the booties to like knock on doors that no political parties knocking on. We knocked on thousands of doors, talked to hundreds of people, did not target people based on political ideology or affiliation or anything like that. And this is a heavily red, predominantly Republican area. And 2/3 of everybody that we talked to identified guaranteed access to healthcare for everyone as a solution for them in that second question that we asked. And right underneath that was like raising jobs. It was like raising wages and benefits. But the broader concept that people really talked about was like, no one should have to work so much that they can't be with their family and enjoy the harvests of their work, like reap benefits of what they're putting in, and that like this is just not sustainable. So I think for one, it's like everybody values grit and hard work and dedication. And so we can rally around the idea that like any hard work, and I personally as a leftist, I'm like, I don't actually think you should have to work to survive because a lot of people can't necessarily work under capitalist standards to survive. But I do think that we as like a leftist movement could rally around the idea that any working person shouldn't be struggling to survive, and that every person, regardless of working status and these other things, should have access, guaranteed access to healthcare. I think those are the 2 big tent issues that a lot of folks agree on.
All right, and then the reverse of that, the inverse. What are some lesser known or less talked about issues on the left that you think should be talked about more?
I think for a movement that for a long time has tapped into some of what we might call identity politics around like racial disparities and gender and sexuality equity. I think what we are missing is that a lot of times we still point the finger at each other and like have this crabs in a barrel syndrome on the left, where it's like we still point the finger at like rural folks or Southern folks or Appalachian folks. Like we find another group of the proletariat, or like whatever you want to call them, who is the one that we're blaming and scapegoating, instead of like figuring out how do we pull that part of us, because there's still us, in, so that we can point the finger up and like really address what's happening up here. And I think sometimes we get so caught up in our version of right and wrong that we forget that like we still have to meet human beings where they are, because they are still human beings. And just because we want someone to meet, like, see our version of right and wrong because we feel so deeply compelled around it, like, doesn't actually mean that it's gonna move that person across their cognitive dissonance just because we want them to. And like actually I think that is where the discomfort should be for left. Like we should be leaning into that discomfort, especially white leftists, of like, how do we bring the other poor white folks into the leftist space instead of isolating them more and pushing them out? And I think that like that is really hard, uncomfortable work, especially when I think sometimes we as white leftists can even see some of ourselves in there. There's like a little bit of guilt, right, when we're like navigating these spaces. And I think instead of like calling out like people who say shitty things, and I'm not talking about like famous people or people with a platform who are like using them clearly for nefarious and like malicious intentions. I'm talking about like Joe Bob down the street who didn't graduate from high school, who's working at the local mill, and who hasn't heard any other messaging besides what he receives from Fox News and Sinclair Media, right? Like if we call out Joe Bob and make Joe Bob feel shame and blame because we feel righteous as a white leftist and like, oh, I have moral clarity and you don't, then we're not actually moving Joe Bob into the fight for liberation with us, right? We're moving Joe Bob farther away. And I think that's really what we as a leftist movement are missing, is that like we have to embody an alternative culture to the culture of violent white supremacist capitalism that has taught us that we can just like dispose of each other and write each other off, instead of standing with each other in discomfort and healing and calling each other in.
All right, lovely. This has been a fantastic interview. We are 52 minutes in, and we still have 3 separate slates of questions. I don't know how late you're willing to go. I'm free for the rest of the night. How about yourself?
I could probably go for like 15, 20 more minutes.
All right, then we'll just do one more slate of questions.
Okay, cool.
What do you think are some of the major obstacles for the left? You sort of hit on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm like, ourselves, if we can get over our, like, if we can get out of our own damn way and stop thinking that there is one right way to build a revolution, I just don't think that that's true. I think there are multiple truths and multiple right ways, as long as we can come together around those right ways and like fit together like puzzle pieces. That's what I'm trying. That's what I think would be the most successful thing. But I think we keep being like, no, you have to be square because I'm a square, instead of like instead of your puzzle piece can fit into mine in these ways.
All right. What do you think are some of the greatest strengths of the left?
I think our adaptability and our flexibility. I think we've been really forced to learn and adjust to the overwhelming tactical advantages of the rich and powerful. And as a result, like our movement has, I mean, we're on Discord doing an interview right now that's going to be published on YouTube, right? Because we're like, how do we get the message out? We have to adapt. We have to learn and be flexible. And I think that's actually our biggest strength, because if we can keep it's only our biggest strength if we can keep our goal in mind, so that we have a strategy that we know about, that we can like make tactical decisions on the fly around. So if we can address that weakness, I think that I just mentioned, then I think that our strength is actually this flexibility.
All right, then what do you think the left could be doing better right now?
I think leaning into more evidence-based practices around human behavior as opposed to reading all of this like economic and political theory that in some history, which is rooted in evidence, but like I think instead of reading like a bunch of Marx and a bunch of math, all of the stuff, actually, once we have ourselves grounded in a theory, if that's what, like, I don't think it's bad to read those things, but I think what we need more of is knowing what evidence-based practices actually change human behavior when you are talking to someone one-on-one. Because the truth is, like, I can read every leftist community organizing book in the world, but unless I'm able to bring other people into the movement with me, then I'm fucked. Like, I can't do this by myself. And I think that's what we left need to realize, that we need to figure out how to approach people from a place of like genuinely being able to move them.
All right. I think this next question is perfect for you. What are some groups of people the left could do a better job of reaching out to?
The poor white folks, the poor rural white folks, the hillbillies, the rednecks, the southerners. I mean, the folks who, if they were a coal miner, part of a coal mine uprising, then get them involved. The folks that we should be unionizing, like if they should be in a union, get them, organize them. If they are poor working class, whether they are working a trade skill, if they're in fast food work, like these are the folks who are going to win the revolution, are the folks who have nothing left to lose. So those are the people that we need to be pulling in.
Then what do you think is some of the best ways for the left to achieve its aims? We've talked electoralism, we've talked organizing. What do you think is the best way for us to push forward? Is it a multifaceted approach, or do we just got to lock down to one thing?
Multifaceted approach with a strategic collaboration. I don't think we need to be multifaceted in silos, but I do think those 4 R's, whether we call them by those same names, which is really, it's just like a fancy, it's like 4 names for dual power essentially, right? Like I think, but those 4 R's, the resist, the reform, the reimagine, and the recreate, I do think that it is a multifaceted approach, and I do think that there has to be communication and intentional strategic collaboration across those approaches. So that way, when the resistors are saying, hey, we are going to call for a general strike from these main industries, whether it's like fast food and retail industries, like across the nation, they call on their recreators to say, like, we need y'all to build a robust mutual aid network because that's what you're good at. And we need somewhere for our people who are stepping out of the system and disrupting to be able to go to. And like, I can't organize disruption while also organizing mutual aid because that's a lot of work, right? So we need each other, and we need to know where each other are at so that we can support each other and lean on each other and bounce off of each other. And I think that we've seen examples of this throughout history too, right? Like the Black Panthers were very much so the resistors and to like using guns and violence as necessary, whereas like MLK's movement was much more of the reformers and like we're gonna like ask for what we need and do like nonviolent marches. But if it hadn't have been, and there was a piece of MLK's work and the Black Panthers and other work too that was recreating a new way of being inside of like the poor people's tent city during the March on Washington, right? Where they were like, they had kitchens where people were making food for the folks who were camping out at the tent city. They even had Sunday services that were available so people could have that like spiritual need met. And so I think that if it hadn't have been for the threat that the state entities felt as a result of the resistors being like, oh, we got Black people armed in the streets, we got to do something, then they wouldn't have caved to the demands of the reformers to the same extent if it had just been these reformers pushing that on them. And likewise, I think that if the reformers hadn't have been there and there had just been this threat of the resistors, then the state wouldn't have gone to that solution of reformation as opposed to just suppression of the resistors who were rising up. And so I think that it really does take this multifaceted effort. And I think part of what one of the narratives that the rich and powerful depend on is siloing these efforts and preventing us from coordinating across these multifaceted ways and shaming and blaming each other for participating in totally righteous and valid means of building power through these multifaceted paths.
Okay, last question of this slate. What groups do you think are helping the left the most? And I need to capitalize that.
What groups do I think are helping the left the most? I don't see a lot of groups in my neck of the woods that are like there genuinely is not like a community organizing presence out here. So a lot of what I do is trying to build that out through, and maybe this is why I consider myself more anarcho, is because it's like I don't actually have a model here for like that really concerted, organized version of this work, and I've had to really create actually more of like like pockets of kind of self-organized groups based on like location as opposed to like a shared organizational identity. And so I don't know that I feel like I have an adequate answer to this question. I think I've seen folks in like the Asheville area, which is the closest place that I've seen groups really organize. I've seen the Socialist Rifle Association do some really great work around like offering simultaneously like free brake light changes and like that form of mutual aid, as well as like education around leftism like at those events. But I actually haven't seen, like, we don't really have a presence of like any like Communist Party movements out here. Like we don't have a presence of any like John Brown Gun Club or anything like that. So it's like it's hard for me the most effective group organizing is like just we the people. And actually I wonder if there's a way in which that having organizational identity instead of an identity that's shared as like the working class, the people, the poor folks is one of the ways that we end up like accidentally isolating ourselves and like dividing ourselves.
All right. With only a couple of minutes left, I think about 10 at this point, how about we just fire off some rapid fire questions to get your takes on it, and then we'll close out the night. You've been a wonderful guest great. So far. I've been an absolute delight.
Thank you.
What do you say to new or young emerging leftists?
Get to work, do the work, practice more than you preach, and go to therapy, please, for the love of God.
All right, lovely. What do you say to the average liberal?
Oh, definitely. Your number one job as a liberal is to go to therapy. Like that is what I need for you to like go unpack the shit and then come into the work. Like, don't come in here with this savior complex. I'm not here for it.
What do you say to independents / politically uninvolved folks?
The personal is political, and it doesn't have to look like voting, but hosting a community potluck can be political. So get to know your neighbors, their safety and solidarity, build power through conversation. You don't have to be on the front lines holding a protest sign.
All right. What do you say to people who might be on the fence?
On the fence about which side they're on?
Be like that on the fence from liberal to leftist to maybe a conservative who's voted Republican but is now maybe disillusioned with the party given its current trajectory.
I would say that it is totally righteous and valid to not commit to any one identity, and actually it shows that you are strong and committed to your values more than any one particular organization or party. And what that means is that you're starting from a strong place of moral clarity to take action as a good neighbor and a good community member to your people, and that you can make a bigger impact literally in your neighborhood than you can organizing for a political party, and you can learn way more by talking to people in your community too.
All right, and last two. What do you say to the average Republican voter?
Do you want to grab a beer? That's what I would say to them, because I would have a lot of questions and I would want to know more about their story and about what led them to considering themselves a Republican voter.
All right. Final question. What do you say to the Bernie or bust crowd, the voting is useless crowd? What do you say to the people uh, who for whatever reason, are disillusioned with the electoral system as it stands?
I would say that's totally righteous and totally valid. And there's a lot of very real experiences that have been intentionally manifested to make us feel that way. And so there's nothing wrong with feeling that way or acting accordingly. I think what I would discourage is, if you don't want to get involved with the electoral system, consider that the reform piece of the 4 R's. And then what I would encourage is for you to pick one of those other 3 R's that really does spark your interest and feels like you can lean into it and get involved with it. So if you're really into mutual aid, go support a mutual aid network or start one if there isn't one already. If you're really into sticking it to the man, go be a resistor, get arrested for disrupting legislative sessions where they aren't actually talking about the things that need to be talked about. If you're really into art and creation and reimagining things, then be a part of the creative protest, the banner drops that really draw attention and get our narrative out there. There's a lot of other ways to get involved outside of the electoral system. And I think part of what is dangerous about us just harping on voting is that it ends up making folks who are disillusioned with the system feel like that's the only way that they can get involved, and it's not. So if you don't feel like voting, that's okay. But that doesn't mean that you have to surrender all of your power. There's lots of other ways to reclaim and build power.
All right, and that is our final question for the night. So before I turn it back over to our guests for their final closing statements and shout outs, I will remind everyone you can find all of our interviews as well as the Monday shows and the debates all on my YouTube channel, all hosted there exclusively. I do my daily shows on TikTok and YouTube, but my interviews, debates, and the Monday shows are held exclusively on YouTube. Support us on Patreon if you'd like to see more content like this. And turn it back over to my guest. Give us your final thoughts, closing statements, and shout yourself out one more time.
Thank you so much for lifting my voice up on your platform. Normally, I'm lifting up other voices. I interview folks on my podcast, and so it was really cool to be interviewed by someone else for a change. And I just appreciate it so much. And I think if folks are more interested about radical leftist Appalachian history throughout, from starting at colonialism to the modern day, or hearing the voices of more Appalachians who are doing this work, if you find that you have biases or stereotypes about the Appalachian region that you're surprised to hear some of my takes, I would definitely encourage you to please check out the podcast and or my TikTok page if that's more of your style for visuals. I don't do visual editing like YouTubers. Y'all are amazing. I cannot do it. But you can find everything on our linktree/Rednecks Rising, all lowercase, one word.
And I will be making sure to link our guest in the description down below where you can find them. You can also find them in the Discord server where me and all of my other interviewees collaborate, hang out, as well as plan for things like the Monday show, which I will be inviting our lovely guest for if they are available. With that, everyone, thank you for this lovely interview. It's been delightful. I loved having you on, Chelsea, as a guest. And with that, good night.
Good night.